We've all heard of the gangsters of the 1920s and 30s. The more famous of the lot, George Remis and Al Capone, had organized crime syndicates that revolved around the business of making, selling, and transporting alcohol products that had been banned in the United States from 1920 to 1933. Thus, by definition, they were also bootleggers and smugglers. That's the topic for today's video. But first, we have to go on a short detour to give you a bit of background about that era in U.S. history. Between 1919 and 1929, the number of passenger cars in the U.S. ballooned from 6.5 million to 23 million, quickly overwhelming local road infrastructure built originally for horse-drawn carriages and wagons. Highways in the 1920s were a mix of poor dirt tracks and evolving paved roads. This era would see the first real efforts to link major cities with paved roads. Travel by automobile between cities remained challenging, marked by frequent car breakdowns, navigational issues, and a lack of coordinated law enforcement. Many states in this era did not have statewide police agencies to handle highway crimes, investigate accidents, or render assistance. The Federal Highway Act of 1921 spurred interstate construction by providing a federal match of 50% for state highway building. In 1922 alone, the federal government completed over 10,000 miles of roadway improvement projects. The creation of the U.S. highway numbering system in 1926 simplified navigation across what had been a confusing web of highways. This early interstate system was nowhere near the level seen in the 1950s during the Eisenhower administration. Airplane travel in the 1920s was primarily for the delivery of the U.S. postal airmail. Most early airplanes of that era were only able to carry a single extra person. Plane travel in the 1930s was loud, cold, and unsettling. Airliners were not pressurized, so they flew at low altitudes and were often bounced about by turbulence. Air travel was very expensive and accidents were distressingly frequent. Thus, railroad service between major cities in the 1920s and 30s was the primary method of moving freight and people between major cities and states in that era. Railroad service was also the most expedient and the safest way to transport gangsters convicted of federal crimes in that era. Prohibition had been advocated as a patriotic effort during World War I. The reasoning was that raw materials employed to produce beer, wine, and whiskey would be better used to make the world safe for democracy. Prohibition proponents claimed that a dry nation would be a better place to live. It would have less crime, productivity would improve because absenteeism, blamed on alcohol abuse, would be reduced in the workplace. Prohibition in the United States officially started on January 17, 1920, when the 18th Amendment to the Constitution banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages went into effect with the passage of the Volstead Act. Named for Minnesota Congressman Andrew Volstead, the act specifically outlawed the manufacture, sale, or transportation of any beverage containing 0.5% or more of alcohol. There were, however, certain exceptions. Doctors were able to prescribe medicinal alcohol for their patients. Religious groups were allowed sacramental wine. The Volstead Act allowed wine and cider to be made from fruit at home, but not beer. Up to 200 gallons of wine and cider per year could be made for personal use. Importantly, the act did not prohibit the personal consumption of alcohol. Those financially able to do so stockpiled wines and liquors for such personal use in the latter part of 1919, before sales of alcoholic beverages became illegal in January of 1920. Incredibly, President Woodrow Wilson moved his own supply of alcoholic beverages to his Washington residence after his term in office ended. His successor, Warren G. Harding, relocated his own large supply into the White House. Alcohol production for industrial and scientific purposes did, however, remain legal. On December 15, 1919, the United States Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of Prohibition. Distillers in Kentucky faced major losses. There were 9.5 million gallons of liquor in bonded warehouses in the Louisville, Kentucky area alone. The market value was about $380 million. The distillers' only hope to salvage their investment was to export the liquor. Starting December 24, 1919, a rail caravan began transporting 1.2 million gallons of this Kentucky liquor to eastern seaports for shipment overseas. It required 220 boxcars to haul the whiskey from Kentucky to the coast. Because of the increasing scarcity and value of the load, each train had armed guards. The whiskey arrived in Cincinnati on the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. From Cincinnati to Cleveland, it traveled on the New York Central Main Line. 3 federal agencies were initially assigned the task of enforcing the Volstead Act: the United States Coast Guard, the U.S. Treasury's IRS Bureau of Prohibition, and the U.S. Department of Justice's Bureau of Prohibition. In total, over 1,500 federal agents were tasked with enforcement. Ultimately, Prohibition proved to be a failure. In 1930, the Prohibition Commissioner estimated that in 1919, the year before the Volstead Act became law, the average drinking American spent $17 per year on alcoholic beverages. By 1930, because enforcement diminished the available supply, spending had increased to $35 per year. There was no inflation during this period. The result was an illegal alcohol beverage industry that made an average of $3 billion per year in illegal, untaxed income. George Remis was a Chicago pharmacist and attorney. In his Chicago law practice, he noticed the criminals he was defending as a lawyer were getting rich off of bootlegging, which is the production of illicit and untaxed alcohol. Remis, already wealthy from representing this client base, began studying the Volstead Act and found numerous glaring loopholes. This is where his pharmaceutical background kicked in. Under the Volstead Act, one could get a certificate to be served alcohol under the premise of medical necessity. This allowed Remis to abuse the system and the market. Remis discovered that Cincinnati, with its access to 7 major railroads and located within a few hundred miles of distilleries that produced over 80% of all bonded alcohol, was an ideal place to make another fortune. Remis established political connections with the newly installed administration of President Harding's Department of Justice. These federal officials enabled the granting of withdrawal permits for medicinal whiskey for a very modest fee, otherwise known as a bribe. As part of the scheme, Remis acquired a pharmacy in Covington, Kentucky, renamed it the Kentucky Drug Company, and began withdrawing the whiskey he owned in 1,000-case lots for distribution in this medicinal market. Remis purchased distilleries, pharmacies, and created trucking companies for this illicit empire throughout the Midwest. His own employees would then fake thefts, hijackings, and accidents of his medicinal alcohol shipments so that Remis, in turn, could reacquire the supposed missing goods and sell it in the illegal market. One of his notable clients was an up-and-coming Al Capone. A 50-acre farm in Cincinnati that served as home base for his enterprise was also acquired for the operation. Within 3 years of setting up his illegal business, Remis pulled in $40 million, with a reported $20 million spent on bribes to local police, politicians, judges, and federal agents throughout the Midwest and in Washington, D.C. In April 1921, a northbound Baltimore and Ohio passenger train had struck a truck on Ohio Route 4 just outside of Hamilton, Ohio. The truck, owned by Remis's Kentucky Drug Company, was traveling from Frankfort, Kentucky to Buffalo, New York, hauling 200 cases of medicinal, therefore legal whiskey, to a drug company there. 2 men in the truck escaped injury. The front of the locomotive, however, was sprayed with the contents of the broken bottles, receiving a whiskey bath. Most of the spirits and half pints survived the crash, but were tossed around the tracks. When the train stopped at the accident scene, passengers rushed off to gather the unbroken bottles scattered on the tracks and in a nearby field. The same passengers, disembarking at the Hamilton train station, were seen to depart with pockets bulging. All were smiling broadly. In May 1922, Remis and his cronies went on trial on charges of conspiring to violate the Volstead Act and were found guilty. Remis was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison and a $1,000 fine. After all the appeals to his conviction was exhausted, Remis would surrender himself to U.S. Marshal Stanley Borthwick in Cincinnati on January 24, 1924. Along with 12 other co-conspirators sentenced in his case and accompanied by guards and Marshal Borthwick, the group took a short ride by charter bus to the Union Central Station and placed aboard a special Cincinnati Southern rail car to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia. Remis obligingly took a top bunk so that one of his co-conspirators, a man of rather large dimensions, could reside in the lower berth. He made his Pullman car porter a present of his last silk shirt before leaving the train. Remis would be released in October of 1927. I hope you've enjoyed today's program. If you found this program interesting, consider subscribing to our YouTube channel for notifications of the second part next week. We'd really appreciate if you would like and share this video with your friends. It helps the channel out. Many thanks to those who assisted in the research and production of today's program, including members of the Cincinnati Railroad Club, whose support is crucial in the distribution of these videos, as well as the Public Library of Cincinnati and Hamilton County. Until we meet next time on the High Iron, stay safe out there.